By late 1942, the United States was finally ready to fight the war it had watched from afar. Troops were trained, ships were loaded, and the first great Allied invasion was set. Only one thing was missing: the enemy they were about to attack. When the landing craft dropped their ramps that morning, American soldiers found themselves face to face with people who were supposed to be on the same side. It wasn't France, it wasn't Germany, it wasn't what anyone expected. On November 8, 1942, thousands of American soldiers stormed beaches, not in France, not in Italy, but in North Africa. The operation was called Operation Torch, and it marked the first time U.S. troops faced Axis forces in the European-African theater. For many of the soldiers, it felt like the wrong war in the wrong place. They'd trained to liberate Europe, not to fight the French on African soil. But for the Allies, it was the only way forward. This was the day America officially entered the ground war against Hitler's Europe by landing on the other side of the Mediterranean. By the summer of 1942, the Allies faced a strategic crisis. The Soviet Union was demanding a second front to relieve pressure at Stalingrad. The British were fighting Rommel's Africa Corps in Egypt. American planners wanted to strike directly at France. But the British, led by Churchill, argued that an invasion across the English Channel was impossible that year. Not enough landing craft, air cover, or trained divisions. So the Allies compromised. They'd attack French-controlled North Africa, which was under the pro-Axis Vichy government. It would be easier to reach, lightly defended, and offered ports, airfields, and a base for future operations. It wasn't the grand invasion Roosevelt's generals wanted. It was a political and logistical gamble, an American invasion of territory still technically controlled by France. The plan divided the invasion into 3 landing zones. In the west, Casablanca on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, led by General George S. Patton. In the center, Oran in western Algeria. And in the east, Algiers, the political heart of French North Africa. Each landing would be separate, launched from British ports, coordinated by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was commanding his first major operation. But the biggest question wasn't the Germans, it was the French. Would Vichy forces fight? Would they switch sides? American diplomat Robert Murphy, stationed in Algiers, spent months trying to convince local French officers to stand down when the invasion came. Some agreed, others refused. The Allies didn't know who would shoot until the first boats hit the shore. When the date was set, November 8th, Eisenhower's order went out under a simple code phrase: play ball. At dawn, the largest amphibious operation in history so far began, on a continent that wasn't even the main target. The invasion plan relied on one big assumption, that the French wouldn't shoot. North Africa was controlled by Vichy France, a regime that collaborated with Germany but technically wasn't part of the Axis. For months before the invasion, Robert Murphy and a handful of OSS officers tried to negotiate with sympathetic French commanders in Algiers. The hope was to trigger a local uprising the moment Allied troops landed. Some officers, like General Charles Mast, quietly promised help. Others hesitated, fearing German retaliation or seeing the Americans as naive newcomers. In secret meetings, Murphy offered assurances from Washington. This wasn't an attack on France, but a liberation from German control. Still, the chain of command was fractured. Admiral François Darlan, Vichy's commander in the region, happened to be in Algiers visiting his sick son when the invasion began, a twist of timing that would decide the fate of the operation. When the landing started, confusion reigned. Some Vichy units stood down, others fought back. The diplomacy had bought time, but not peace. At dawn on November 8, 1942, the largest amphibious operation in history so far began. Over 100,000 Allied troops in more than 350 ships approached 3 coasts: Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. At Casablanca, General George S. Patton commanded 35,000 men, supported by the U.S. Navy's Western Naval Task Force under Admiral Hewitt. Poor weather scattered the landing craft, but the troops came ashore under sporadic fire. At Oran, British and American units landed on two beaches west and east of the city, while a small force tried a direct assault inside the harbor itself, Operation Reservist. French shore batteries and ships fought back fiercely. Both British destroyers leading the assault, the Heartland and Walney, were sunk at point-blank range. In Algiers, landings east and west of the city met little organized resistance. Inside the capital, a network of pro-Allied French officers, many tied to Murphy's group, launched a coup that seized key points before dawn. By nightfall, two things were clear. The Americans had successfully landed on foreign soil, and the easy invasion was already costing lives on both sides. The hardest fighting came at the ports. At Casablanca, French ships and coastal guns opened fire on the American fleet. The brief but violent naval battle of Casablanca saw U.S. battleships, including the Massachusetts, dueling with Vichy cruisers and destroyers. French submarine Méduse was sunk. The battleship Jean Bart, still unfinished in port, fired back until bombed by carrier aircraft. At Oran, the French garrison held out for 2 days, refusing to surrender even as Allied armor rolled through the suburbs. When the port finally fell, more than 1,000 French soldiers were dead or wounded. In Algiers, the coup by French officers succeeded before the landings reached full force. Admiral Darlan, caught in the middle, realized resistance was pointless and agreed to a ceasefire by November 10th. Within 72 hours, most of French North Africa was in Allied hands. The cost had been real, but the diplomatic gamble had worked, just barely. And behind the victory lay an uneasy truth. America's first battle on the road to Europe had been fought not against Germans, but against other Western soldiers, men who, days later, would become their allies. Once the beachheads were secure, Allied columns pushed inland. The next objective, Tunisia, the narrow bridge between North Africa and Europe. But the Axis reacted fast. Within days, German and Italian troops began airlifting reinforcements into Tunis. Luftwaffe units from Sicily strafed Allied convoys before they could advance. The Allied command structure was chaotic. Eisenhower directed the operation from Gibraltar, coordinating British, American, and Free French units that had never fought together before. The French armistice commanders were unsure which side they were on. The British First Army, advancing from Algiers, found itself racing the Germans for control of the same airfields. By late November, the first clashes with German armor began near Medjez el Bab. What had started as a landing against Vichy, forces quickly became the first face-to-face combat between American and German soldiers in World War II. For the Americans, North Africa was a baptism by fire. Most units had never seen combat. They were green, poorly coordinated, and still learning basic combined arms tactics. General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2nd Corps, spread his divisions too thin, fortifying hills far from each other. When the Germans counterattacked in early 1943 at the Kasserine Pass, the U.S. Army suffered a humiliating defeat. More than 6,000 casualties and hundreds of vehicles lost. The lesson was brutal but necessary. Eisenhower replaced Fredendall with George S. Patton, who reorganized the Corps, improved discipline, and began retraining the Army for offensive warfare. From those failures came experience that would define the U.S. Army for the rest of the war, learning logistics, air-ground coordination, and how to fight an experienced enemy on his own terms. By May 1943, the Allies had advanced across Algeria and Tunisia. The Axis position in North Africa collapsed. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, roughly the same number captured at Stalingrad months earlier. With the coast cleared, the Allies gained control of the entire Western Mediterranean. The victory gave them springboards for the next invasions, Sicily in July 1943 and Italy soon after. Strategically, Torch achieved everything its planners hoped for. It pulled Axis attention south, reopened Mediterranean shipping lanes, and united American and British forces under a single command structure that would later be used for D-Day. Politically, it also ended Vichy France's control in North Africa. French forces under General Henri Giraud and Charles de Gaulle began merging into the Free French Army, which would later return to Europe in 1944. Operation Torch wasn't glamorous, but it changed the direction of the war. It was the first test of American soldiers against Axis troops, the first time Eisenhower commanded a multinational invasion, and the beginning of Allied cooperation that would culminate in Normandy. The invasion also taught hard lessons about planning, leadership, and diplomacy. Lessons learned not in France or Germany, but on the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. By landing on the wrong continent first, the Allies found the experience they needed to invade the right one later.